Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We do have a crowd here in room 309. Come on in, hello. And folks joining us on Zoom. So welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Zeisman. I'm Executive Director of Hawaii Children's Action Network. And we are so pleased to have a crowd here in the room and on Zoom for our webinar training conversation about understanding Hawaii's state budget and taxes. We will have two speakers today that are both incredibly knowledgeable, and I think we are hoping it will be interactive Q&A. Like, we want this to be a conversation. I think a lot of us are learning and growing in this space. So our first speaker will be Will White, who is here in room 309. And Will is the director of the Budget and Policy Center housed at Hawaii Appleseed. And our second speaker is Nicole Wu, who is the director of Economic Policy and Research at Hawaii Children's Action Network. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Will.
Great, thanks, Deb. Can everyone on the Zoom hear me okay? Oh, I can't see you, so I'm just going to assume.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Again, my name is Will White. I'm the director of the Hawaii Budget and Policy Center, which is a project of Hawaii Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice. We are a project focused primarily on the state's budget and tax system and working to develop various research products that can help both advocates, legislators, and members of the general public get a better grasp of some of these issues. So today, I'm going to give a very high-level overview of the state budget process, how it works. And for those of you that are interested in more in-depth conversations, if some questions come up, then you really want to dig into the weeds, I'm more than happy to set up a follow-up meeting with folks. But we will have some Q&A after both presentations, and hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions that you have here in the room today. So first of all, I thought that we would ground this presentation in a saying that is almost become a bit of a cliche at this point, but it's very much true. And this grounds all of the work that we do whenever we think about budgets. And this is something that we go back to, that budgets are really a statement of our values. They're more than just numbers on a page that show you how much is going to each department. It really shows you what the state is prioritizing, where they want to put the state's resources, and what kinds of programs, what kinds of populations that they want to invest in. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind as we go through this question, and keep asking yourself, based on the information that's presented, what does the state in fact value according to our budget? So even though the budget is an incredibly important document, it can often be very difficult to understand. There are literally hundreds of pages of bills, worksheets, and the like, which can kind of be complicated to go through and to pore over, especially if you don't exactly know what you're looking for. So here you'll just see a few of the examples. We've got a budget worksheet, we've got the budget bill itself, and then of course our capital website, working to comb through all the various appropriations bills, as well as the budget bill itself. It can be a little overwhelming. So that's why we created the Hawaii Budget Primer. This was really the first project that we did when we founded the center in 2018. And we're working to create follow-up budget primers each year so that we can really dig into the numbers, help advocates, help legislators figure out what's really going on with the budget process so that you don't have to go and dig through those hundreds of pages of bills and worksheets. And hopefully we can provide this in somewhat concise and meaningful way that folks can easily grasp. So first off, I want to just talk about the budget cycle and how it works. So as you can see, the main takeaway from this is that the budget process is really a year-long process. It's not something that only happens while the legislature is in session, right? This is something that's constantly moving and constantly being negotiated, constantly being talked about between departments, the governor's office, as well as the legislature. So as you can see, we're here in December. the state operates on a fiscal biennium budget. So in odd numbered years, we create a 2-year budget, and then the budget is then updated in the even numbered years, just to go back and see if we need to put more money in a certain place or take money away, right? So heading into next year, we're actually heading into a new fiscal biennium. That'll be for fiscal years 23-24 and 24-25. And then for folks here working in the building, this is probably the most pertinent part for you folks and the work that you do going into January is the legislature really taking the governor's budget draft, which I think should be out any day now. He's required to submit it 30 days before the legislature goes into session. So keep your eyes peeled for that document, because that's going to be really the governor's first proposal. It's my understanding that our new governor will probably go back and make some adjustments here and there. But at that point, it will be handed over to the legislature, where the conversation is really going to start to take off about whether or not they agree with the governor's proposal, whether or not they want to reduce certain expenditures or even expand some of those expenditures. So that work is going to be really kicking off in earnest in January through March and April, by which point we should have a budget approved by the legislature. The governor will then approve it. The governor does have limited line item veto power in the fact that he can reduce spending amounts from the budget, but he can't really add any money. That needs to be appropriated by the legislature. So once the budget is in effect, we move into our summer months where our departments are really implementing and spending that money down. But at the same time, they're also developing their plan for the next year. Right. So this is where these conversations start to happen at the department level of, hey, what are these priorities that we're going to have for the next year? What's going well? What can we do better at? And then as we move into the fall, as the governor is preparing his draft budget, departments will submit their proposals to the Department of Budget and Finance. And then through negotiation between BUF and the departments and the governor's office, they will figure out what's going to make the final cut in the governor's draft proposal, which then he will then submit to folks.
Hey, Will,
yeah.
Real quick, can you share your screen? People online can't see your slides. Is it possible, whatever laptop you're using, can we share the screen?
Whoa. That is a rookie mistake. I am so sorry. Let's do that. Folks on Zoom, are you seeing that?
Yes, thank you, Will.
Great, great. So sorry about that, folks. Okay. So here you can see, sorry, I just need to move. Can you guys see Zoom? There we go. Here's the size of our most recent budget. Calls for spending of $24 billion roughly. And the legislature has to approve budgets for both for the executive branch, the judiciary, OHA, which is a quasi-governmental agency, kind of semi-independent, and the legislative branch. But as you can see, the vast majority of the spending is being dedicated toward the executive branch. These are the various departments that are making up, the Department of Human Services, Department of Health, Department of Education. These are really big departments that have a lot of responsibility. So it makes sense that a majority of the spending would be concentrated on those. So, and this is just showing our, sorry, can you guys see that? Okay, this is our operational budget and then other appropriations. So the operational budget is just sort of the stuff that supports the ongoing work of the agency. The other appropriations, these are one-time spending measures, usually with an end date, usually about a year. And if that money goes unspent, it's reverted back into the general fund. And then also the capital improvement budget, which we will talk about a little bit later. So here we'll dig down a little bit more specifically into the various departments. And this should give you a snapshot of where our money is being spent. And going back to my original slide that I kicked the presentation off with, this shows you really where our values are, right? This shows you what we value as a state. So down here at the bottom, you'll see the Department of Budget and Finance has a massive budget relative to any other agency. That's for a couple of reasons. Budget and Finance is responsible for paying state employee benefits, retiree amounts, servicing debt. So their budget is actually kind of, unusually large because they have those other responsibilities that they have to take care of. The Human Services Department is also massive, right? So the state's largest program that we operate is our MedQuest program. This is the state's Medicaid program. Incredibly expensive program to run and operate. We're also receiving federal funds, and the state is required to put up a local match. So that is a must. And then the State Department of Education, also the third largest in terms of spending, just because it has the highest payroll of any other agency, because we're paying all of the state's teachers. We are I think the only state to have a single school district. So that would explain why our DOE budget is so large. But then again, if you dig down a little bit deeper, and I recommend folks look into our budget primer, because after we get through the overview of the budget, we actually do a deep dive on every single department that lays out how much is appropriated in one time and ongoing support. So you'll see here, the Department of Hawaiian Homelands have really had a banner year this year, but the vast majority of that is a one-time appropriation. That's that $600 million that folks keep hearing about in the news and reading about. That funding has an expiration date. The agency has until 2025 to spend it. If they don't, lapses back into the general fund. But really key here is looking at the size of their operating budget relative to the other agencies that we see, right? So you can see, for example, the Department of Public Safety, their budget is around $320 million. Averaging around that. The HHL, on the other hand, is $100 million. So we're spending 3 times more on incarcerating people than we are building homes for the Native Hawaiian community. And it's graphics like this that really start to help folks understand where our values are and where our money is going and what we're prioritizing as a state. So as the legislature is crafting their budget, the emphasis is always going to be on the general fund. We're going to talk about the various means of finance a little bit later. But the general fund is really the most flexible spending that the legislature has. It supports usually around half the budget. This year, it's a little bit larger just because we had such a big budget surplus. And, the state just has more control because it's funded by taxes, right? But another thing to keep in mind is that when we do enter a recession, those items that are supported by the general fund are most likely on the top of the heap for the biggest cuts in the chopping block. So something to keep in mind there. Also playing a very big role in how the legislature and the governor craft their budget proposal is the Council on Revenues. So the Council on Revenues is a 7-member panel that meets 4 times a year. Here you can see the dates that they meet. 3 of those positions are appointed by the governor, and 2 each are appointed by the Senate President and the House Speaker. These folks are usually economists, sometimes people working in the finance sector, and they create a proposal for or a forecast for how much revenue the general fund is going to have each year. And these kinds of projections are really instrumental in helping the governor get a hold of or get a handle on how much money he's going to have to play around with for his initial draft, and then also really helping to inform the legislature as they deliberate the governor's draft. They also create a personal income forecast a couple of times a year. This is just an estimate of how much real income is actually going to be generated by the state to give us an idea of the size of our economy. And for folks that have these are all public meetings, I definitely recommend you sit in on one of them. If you ever want to watch a bunch of economists debate the assumptions that they're making in their Excel spreadsheets, this is fascinating content. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for those, and you can log in, and all the reports are on the Department of Taxation's website. All right, so now we're getting into the good stuff. Means of finance. All right, so important to remember, everything that is authorized in the budget needs to be connected to a means of finance or the fund that's going to pay for it. We got to identify where is this money coming from. So I just want to take a little bit of time to dig into some of the various means of finance that are making up our budget. So here you'll see sort of the overall picture. As you can see, the general fund, much larger than 50%, a little bit larger this year, but that's always going to be the lion's share of what's making up the budget. We've also got special funds at a smaller percentage. Federal funds, those are very variable. We don't know how much the federal government is actually going to give each year, and it can fluctuate from time to time. Because of COVID-19, we also have federal pandemic relief funds. Most of those funds have already been spent down by the state. Happy to talk about that. And then the other funds, these are things like trust funds and things of that nature. So let's dig in a little bit more on each of these means of finance more specifically. So the general fund, really supported by taxes, right? 50% of which is coming from our state's general excise tax. It's the biggest contributor to the state's revenue. Second biggest contributor is our income tax. We have a relatively progressive income tax. And I know Nicole is going to be talking about our tax system later. Yeah, here seeing the breakdown, it's very clear that the GET is really the driver for the state's revenue here. And then you've got some other taxes like our transient accommodation tax and a number of others, there's corporation tax, capital gains tax, things of that nature. The next slice is the special fund. So these are things like UH tuition, all gets paid into a special fund that can only be expended for UH's purposes. We've got the Hawaiʻi Health Systems Corporation. That's the very limited public hospital system that we still maintain today. And then things like gas taxes, right? They're paying for roads and boats and airports. The federal funds, again, variable. But these are the things that we often require, the state is often required to pay like a match, sometimes referred to as a maintenance of effort. So for our Medicaid program, our TANF program, our education also has a maintenance of effort requirement as well. Federal funds, as I said before, this has largely been spent, but some of it's been spent on the Department of Education. There are special emergency relief funds, you may have heard, called the GEAR fund, appropriated by the governor's office. But I will say the vast majority of these federal funds were actually spent on the state's unemployment insurance program. We were allocated $1.6 billion or something by the federal government when COVID hit. And we spent 44% of it replenishing the unemployment insurance program. And this is one of those things where it could be seen as a missed opportunity. Those funds are really designed to be geared toward COVID relief specifically. And instead, the state made the decision to replenish the fund rather than increase taxes on corporations that are designed to replenish that fund over time. And then the last one are our other funds. These are revolving funds, very small part of our state's budget. A couple other important elements that I just want to address really briefly before we go on. I know I had mentioned the capital improvement budget. So this should give you an idea of where a majority of our capital improvement spending is going. No surprise, it's on transportation, right? Huge capital improvement costs. Also the state's education system, right? So this is, all of the schools throughout the DOE, including the University of Hawaiʻi. These are facilities that need to be maintained. They need to be updated. So a lot of that spending is going there. Our organization doesn't actually do a lot with capital improvement projects. We're mainly focused on operating budgets, but I think it's still an important component of the budget that I wanted to share with folks today. Right. And another thing to keep in mind is that the budget sets the upper limit of spending. Doesn't actually tell you how much is going to get spent, right? So it's not always the case that just because the money is there, that it actually gets spent. So in this one, we're estimating around 2 billion unspent. The most likely categories of unspent funds happen to be in federal funds and these one-time appropriations, right? And there's a couple of reasons behind that. I mean, we said these one-time appropriations often have a year limit. So if you're not able to get that money out in time, it's going back into the general fund. And then federal funds, departments never know from year to year how much in federal funds they're going to get. So when they're budgeting for it, they're just going to, they have to estimate some kind of number. And the tendency is to overestimate rather than underestimate, right? So that's why you're sometimes finding yourself in a position like that. So yeah, happy to talk more about that. The other thing is really important to keep in mind that this does not get a lot of attention when we talk about the state's finances a lot, but is the growth in our obligated costs. So these are costs that the state is 100% on the hook for. These costs need to be paid first. So there are things like employee pensions, retiree health benefits. You can see the list down there, of course, the Medicaid match. And these obligated costs are growing. So over the last 10 years or so, they've grown by 55%. But the general fund has only grown by 48%. So the problem that you run into when your obligated costs are growing faster than the general fund, it just really means that there's less money left over for the state to invest in those new programs or those innovations that we want to fund or need to fund. Tax credits. I also would be remiss if I did not mention tax credits, often an overlooked part of the budget. Tax credits are given out for a number of reasons, either to businesses to encourage certain economic activity, or for social welfare to help support working families or encourage certain kinds of behaviors. So here you'll see the breakdown of tax credits that the state offers. I think the key takeaway here is that the vast majority of these tax credits are directed toward industries and economic activities. Right. So basically what it is it creates a system where a very small number of actors are getting the largest amount of tax credits. And then social welfare tax credits, things like the earned income tax credit, are a smaller part. But just want to take another minute and talk about some bright spots and opportunities from this year's budget, because the legislature did do some really great things this year. Number one, I mentioned tax credits for working families. The state made our state earned income tax credit, which is a credit for low-income working families, made it refundable this year. So valuable for working families. Previous iterations of the credit had been a non-refundable credit. But in non-refundable credits for the lowest income households, they're not really able to access the full value of that credit because it only reduces their tax liability. It doesn't actually give them a bigger refund. So converting our credit into a refundable one is actually one of the most powerful things that we can do to uplift working families and help them make ends meet. We talked about Hawaiian homelands earlier. That's a massive investment that they got. That's $600 million. They also increased the base budget up to 100 million. It was hovering around 50 earlier. So that's these are great improvements that the state is making. And we think from our perspective that the state should do even more. So looking at that 600 million, they have that 2025 deadline. It'd be really great if the legislature could look at ways to ensure that funding can, stay with the department, if it isn't in fact spent. And then childcare. This is another big one. Massively important support for working families. The legislature, not increased, but reallocated funding that was cut. $6.9 million worth that was cut to support childcare payments. So legislature being really smart here and putting that money back into the budget and recognizing that working families need that help. So these are the kinds of things that we would like to see, or we would hope to see continue as the legislature starts thinking about future budgets and thinking about other ways that we can lift up working families, like for example, through a child tax credit, for instance, which many states are starting to pass on their own that are working to amplify the federal tax credit. And that is it for me. So I'm happy to stick around after Nicole's presentation to answer any questions that you have, and I will do my best. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and bring up your PowerPoint. Nicole, does that work?
Yes, thanks, Will. And I think if people have questions in their head, you can put them in the chat so that we don't forget them. And then, as Will said, we'll give a lot of time at the end of this our presentations for questions. So again, thank you for coming to this briefing. I'm Nicole Wu. I work at Hawaii Children's Action Network Speaks. I'm the Director of Research and Economic Policy. And we've been a part of the Hawaii Tax Fairness Coalition, which came together back in 2017 around passing the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I'll be talking about, and some other of the tax credits that can help our working families make ends meet. In 2020, when we started facing big budget deficits because of the pandemic and the recession, we turned to looking at new ways to raise revenues for the state in progressive ways, which means raising taxes on those who can actually afford to pay it, those who are lucky enough to be able to afford to pay a little more. So I'll be touching on a lot of these issues, kind of like what Will said. I'm going to try to give a high level overview with a lot of links in the slides for you to dive in deeper, and my email address will be at the end, and I welcome any detailed questions if you have some after this briefing. Okay, so these are the 5 main questions that I hope to cover today. 1 is, where does Hawaii get its taxes from? 2, how does Hawaii compare to other states? 3, how does that affect Hawaii's residents? 4, how can we help Hawaii's families make ends meet? And 5, how can we pay for it? Next slide. And I'm stealing Will's slide that hopefully you recognize, just showing that most of our revenues, are in the general fund that come from taxes. Half of our general fund taxes are from our GET or our sales tax, and about 37% comes from the individual income tax, the one that we all pay on our personal incomes. And then we get a small amount from the tourists, and then a bunch of other taxes. The budget primer has another table. So this is from Will's publication. This table, this chart shows a little more detail. So the blue lines, the blue columns are FY21. That's kind of like last year when we were still having not many tourists, which is why the GET, the blue bar on the left side, is kind of low. FY22 is where we are now, the green bars, and that's a little bit more normal. The green is more how our revenues look most years, and you can see we get most of our revenues from GET, followed by individual income tax, a little bit on the tourists, and then you can see some of the others, including the corporate income tax, and as I said, a couple of other smaller ones. Now, how does this compare to other states, I think is the question. Next slide. And I'm going to start with where we're not getting taxes compared to other states. So next slide. And it's property tax. It's, as Will mentioned, we're the only state with a single statewide school system. And as state legislators, the Constitution does not allow you to impose property taxes at the state level. But I just wanted to mention that when the Tax Foundation does their state-by-state maps of different kind of taxes, it shows that when you look at how much actual owners living in their homes are paying on their properties, Hawaii comes in 50th in the nation at 0.31%. I'm in New Jersey right now, visiting family, and it's 8 or 9 times as much at 2.21%. So that's just something to note. I don't think it's anything that can be changed quickly, but it is it's a big factor sort of in where we're not getting revenue compared to other states. Next slide. And then I mentioned the corporate tax. That was one of the little tiny some of the little tiny columns in the slide comparing all the different revenue sources here in Hawaii. And you can see Hawaii is kind of like a little bit below average at 6.4%. You know, there's a pretty wide range. The highest is, again, New Jersey at 11.5%. And then some other states don't have income taxes, so they are grayed out. Next slide. Now, this is a table from the Department of Taxation, and it's a really interesting, I think, explanation of where the corporate taxes are coming from. The Department of Taxation has a business income report every year, and then at the bottom of this slide, it's a blog post where they explain this part of their report. Local Hawaii corps are what it sounds like, local Hawaii businesses. National corps in their report are those that have business out of state, and they have to like do math to figure out how much of their income is in Hawaii. And as you can see in this chart, in the last 20 years, national corporations have gotten bigger and bigger. We don't have more of them in Hawaii, but they're generating more and more of the sales, more and more of the receipts, which means that they're paying more and more of the corporate taxes. And in fact, according to the Department of Taxation, more than half, 60% of corporate income taxes are paid by out-of-state corporations. Again, more than half of corporate income taxes paid by out-of-state corporations. So I know there's a lot of thinking about how we should try to make sure that those who benefit from Hawaii, who aren't from here, pay their fair share. And it seems like this might be a place to look at. Another interesting thing about the corporate tax is that it's only on net profits. It's on what they make after all of their expenses. Could you imagine if your personal income tax was like that and you only had to pay like what you had left over at the end of the year? So, you know, these taxes are landing on profitable businesses who do have the money to spare. So this might be a place that you could look at for some revenues. Next slide. And then for individual income taxes, back in 2017, when we passed the earned income tax credit, the same bill, the legislature passed the bill that paid for the earned income tax credit by increasing tax rates at the very top. So you can see Hawaii is like second in the nation. That 11% rate it's a marginal tax rate. That means it's not all of the income is at 11% for wealthy people, but it's just their income above a certain amount. So the 11% kicks in for a married couple at $400,000 a year here in Hawaii. So they're not paying 11% on all their income. In fact, they're paying a lower rate. And I'll show that in a future slide. So we can go to the next slide. And just looking at how that comes out for total state tax revenues, you know, even though we have a relatively high income tax rate at the top, the amount of that income tax contributes to our total state tax revenues is a little bit below average. The blue columns are the national average for income tax as a percent of total state tax revenues on the left. And on the right, the blue is the national average for sales taxes as a percent of total state tax revenues. And the orange is Hawaii. And you can see on the right side that while the national average of state revenues coming from retail sales tax is 30%, in Hawaii, as Will said, it's 49–50% in our state. So we really are more reliant on the sales tax than most other states. Next slide.
Oh.
Oops, you went to 2.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I don't
Anyway,
know.
it's okay. So the next question is, how does this all affect Hawaii's residents? And this chart comes from the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. They do charts like this for every state. They've got this massive supercomputer. And I think somebody from ITEP's actually watching this. that they put in the tax laws of every state. It's a level of analysis that we can't do here, but states all across the nation rely, and people on Capitol Hill rely on their analyses. And this is a report showing how those in the lowest versus those in the lowest income levels versus those in the highest income levels, how much they're paying in state and local taxes in Hawaii. So the left bar is the lowest 20% on the income scale. Those are folks making less than $20,000 a year, right? And then it's the next 20%, the next 20%. And then on the right side, they actually split up the top 20% of income earners into 3 categories: the top 1%, the top 5, and then the top 20 in the right side. What you can see here is that our tax system is upside down. In general, I think people who can afford to pay more should pay more. But what we have in Hawaii is that those in the lowest 20% of the income scale are paying 15% of their income in state and local taxes, while those at the top are paying only about 9%. And that's a problem. I think we know we have a homelessness issue here. We have so many families struggling to make ends meet, who are at the lower end of the income scale, and part of the problem is taxes. Next slide. One thing that does help is the personal income tax. As I mentioned, we put some higher brackets at the top to help pay for the earned income tax credit. But even with that top rate, we are seeing that the wealthier people in Hawaii are paying a higher percent of their income in taxes. But even with that 11% rate, because everyone pays the lower rates on their lower levels of income, and that the top rates don't kick in until you make over a certain amount, those at the top 1% who do have some of their income at 11%, they're actually paying 6.2% in personal income taxes. And people in the lowest 20% are not paying much at all because a lot of them don't have tax liability. Next slide. On the other hand, the GET, or sales and excise taxes here in Hawaii, is the main driver, as Will said, of our tax system being upside down, of the lower income people having to pay more. And as you can see, the slope is even sharper for this tax than any other tax here in Hawaii. Those making less than 20%, less than $20,000 a year are paying 10.5% of their income in just GET, while those at the top are paying only about 2%. Next slide. Part of the reason for this is because Hawaii includes in our sales tax absolutely everything, as we all know. The national average for sales tax is covering about 30% of all the things that are sold in the economy. Well, in Hawaii, it's 94%. And that's actually a little bit strange because that number comes from during the pandemic. Usually Hawaii is over 100%. And on the right side, this tax foundation explains why. And that's because our sales tax is different from other states. You might think, oh, it's only 4%. I've seen in other states it's a higher percent. But here in Hawaii, we tax the GET. The GET is going on transactions all along the chain, the supply chain, I guess you could call it. And so there is double taxation, multiple taxation on several items that people buy, and this adds to our cost of living. So this is why the GET does hit low-income people so hard, because they spend almost all their money on necessities, and all of it is hit by the GET. Next slide. Okay, so then how can we help Hawaii's families make ends meet? I just talked about the GET being regressive and hurting folks. And so there has been a lot of talk about taxing or not taxing the sale of food and medicine here in Hawaii. So next slide. This is a blog post from UHERO up at UH. And it's got a lot of background. So I encourage you to take a look at it. And it really looks at other states. It talks about why we tax things. But these are some of their takeaways. They don't think we should exempt food and non-prescription drugs from the GET. Part of it is because it would benefit higher income households and tourists. So we know that the GET is paid by tourists, 30 to 40% are the estimates that I've seen. And even though higher income households are only paying a small percent of their income in GET, because they have so much income, they're actually paying a lot of GET. And a big issue is that it would cost the state about $270 million a year in lost tax revenue. So it's a big question. Where would you get other revenue to fill in that big hole in the budget? And in a way, saying that tourists and higher income households would benefit from this is what they are calling a shotgun approach, instead of a targeted approach to those families and those individuals who really need help. And they point out that the Hawaii Tax Review Commission came to the same conclusion in one of their recent reports. Next slide. So as Will mentioned, this is another one of Will's slides that I stole. As Will mentioned, tax credits are an overlooked part of the budget. That is one way to get money back to folks, to get back to them some of their GET, to give them tax credits at tax time. The taxation, the tax credits that I'm going to look at are the blue square on the upper right, the 24%, the social welfare tax credits. These are the ones for families and individuals to help them get some of their hard-earned money back. So I'm going to focus in on those. Next slide. And I'm sorry about this. I didn't make this chart. I hope it's, again, from the Department of Taxation. They do a report every year on tax credits in the state of Hawaii. So it's a great resource. This is looking just at those social welfare tax credits. The earned income tax credit that Will mentioned, I think he did, is a tax credit that's targeted at working parents. If you have children, you get more of a tax credit, and it's going to soon be targeted so that the lowest income families can get more. The earned income tax credit, though, are the purple parts of the bars. And as you can see, when we passed it, or you passed it in 2017, lower income folks weren't getting it. And that's because it was not refundable. That meant that lower income families couldn't get the full amount of their tax credit. Now, just this past legislative session, the legislature, thank you very much, changed the earned income tax credit to make it refundable. So the purple bars are going to actually get a lot bigger on the left side for the lower income families. And, we think that's the way it really should be, because we know the families on the left side, those are the lower income families that they need it the most. So we're going to be pulling the bars on the left up with more purple, with more earned income tax credit, thanks to what the legislature just passed last session. The blue one, the blue part of the bars, is the food excise tax credit. So this tax credit is literally intended to get some of the GET that's spent on food back to taxpayers. And this one, again, is targeted at lower income families. There are income eligibility limits in it, and it changes the amount you can get based on how much income you have. And as you can see with the blue ones, it's very well targeted to those families that need it the most. The lowest income families are getting the most, and the higher income families on the right, they don't qualify for it. And so that's a well-designed tax credit. It can be increased for inflation. The last time I think it was increased was 2015 or around then. So, that's a place we can look at to get more money back to families. It is, it is claimed by the most families in Hawaii of all the tax credits. The red ones in the middle, that's the low-income household renters tax credit, and it's very small. It's not because we don't have a lot of low-income households who are renting, but it's because it's a complicated tax credit. The tax form includes a place where the renter has to put down their landlord's GE tax ID number, and that's probably kind of difficult for a lot of tenants. So, hopefully there are ways to fix that tax credit. Or, maybe just, find ways to make it so that they don't have to, get their landlord's GETID number. It's not in the law. I'm not sure why it's on the tax form. And then the green one is a tax credit for child and dependent care expenses, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tax credit to help people pay for their child care, or if their spouse or their parent needs, daycare and other dependent care, you get some money back. But it's not very large, the amount of money that you can get. So that's another place where we could help families with dependents, with children who have childcare and dependent care expenses. So we could make the green parts bigger as well. Next slide. And this is just an example of why some of these tax credits are small. The renter's credit, I mentioned it's complicated because of that landlord tax ID number thing, but also it hasn't been improved or increased since the 1980s. Think about how much stuff cost in the 1980s, if you remember how much stuff cost back then. So this chart shows the value of the renter's credit going down. It's the black line at the bottom since 1985, which is about the last time it was improved or increased. The light blue line shows kind of average median incomes here in Hawaii, which have kind of just been flat. And then you can see how the cost of housing, the dark blue line, has gone up. So if this renter's credit, the black line, was intended to help people with their housing, the dark blue line, you can see how it's not doing its job. The black line is not keeping up with the dark blue line. So that's another thing the legislature could easily do, is to both increase the amount of the credit. It's stuck at $50 per, household member, and also increase the eligibility level. As inflation happens, people make more money, and then they rise above the eligibility limit for this credit and for many of the other credits. Next slide. So this is a chart from a report done by HCAN Speaks and the Hawaii Budget and Policy Center, just showing how the number of people getting the tax credits has been going down. We're looking between 2011 and 2019 at the number of claims for these tax credits. And you can see on the left side, the food excise tax credit, there's 87,000 fewer claims being filed for that credit. There's nearly 27,000 fewer renter's credit claims. And the EITC on the right with 60,000, that went up because it didn't start until 2017. But overall, on the very right side, you can see how overall fewer and fewer households are claiming these credits. And that's almost entirely because the income eligibility limits are not going up with inflation. And so just fewer and fewer families are getting them. Originally, I think a lot of these credits were meant to help families who are kind of bumping up into the middle class. But right now they really are, kind of held down so that only lower income parents can really qualify for them. So looking at these eligibility limits, I think, is very important. Next slide. So if we were to increase these credits, increase the eligibility limits, increase the amount that these taxpayers can get back, how do we pay for it? As I said, the Hawaii Tax Fairness Coalition switched from focusing just on credits to focusing on progressive revenues a couple of years ago. So next slide. Here's just a chart from the Hawaii Tax Fairness Coalition page. We started, it's a number of organizations in the coalition, started with probably about 36 ideas, whittled it down to about 11. And some of them, well, I can just kind of go through them. Raising income taxes on those at the top, phasing out the low tax rates for those at the top. So as I was saying, the top tax rate is 11%, but because all taxpayers pay the lower rates on the lower amounts of their income, they're actually paying more like 6.5% at the top. So you could kind of fiddle with that so that they don't benefit from the low tax rates. Taxing investments the same way that regular income is taxed. Hawaii is one of a handful of states that allow income from investments in wealth, like the profits off of stocks and bonds and arts and antique sales. That income is taxed at a lower rate for rich people than regular income for working people. So that's one thing that we could fix. Increase taxes on wealthy inheritances. You know, right now, $5.5 million of inheritances are exempt from any kind of tax. So, you know, other states have played around with that level. Corporate taxes, I mentioned that earlier. We're average to below average in our rate. And a lot of our corporate taxes are coming from out-of-state companies. So that might be a place to go. Making global corporations pay taxes in Hawaii. That's kind of an interesting idea, that there are ways that these global corporations are sort of avoiding taxes here. So figuring out a way to bring that money in is a possibility. Make REITs pay their fair share of taxes. REITs are real estate investment trusts, and some of our largest hotels and shopping malls here in Hawaii are real estate investment trusts. Alexander and Baldwin turned into one a few years ago. And one of the reasons they did is probably because REITs don't have to pay corporate income taxes, unlike basically every other entity in this state. The legislature actually passed this law to make REITs pay taxes a few years ago. The governor, the prior governor, vetoed it. So who knows, maybe it will pass again, and maybe our new governor will have a different attitude towards the REITs tax. The next one is increased taxes on the sales of mansions. Because we can't tax property directly at the state level, one way to kind of get at high value property is looking at the sales tax on every property sale, and that's called a conveyance tax. And so there was a bill that passed a couple of years ago to increase the rate of tax on homes worth more than $4 million. And again, you can fiddle with that level of what's the right level to increase the tax at. That did pass. It was vetoed. So again, maybe there's a chance for it now that there's a new governor. Then there are sin taxes to discourage vaping among our youth, and other tobacco taxes. Also a soda tax, many states are using that. And then the last one was suspending some of our GET exemptions. There are a lot of them for a lot of very unusual entities, let's put it that way. And I think the legislature has played around with that in the past when we've needed some extra revenues. Next slide. And just to get into the capital gains tax, since I already talked about some of the others, this is the one about taxing investments and wealth at the same rate as regular working people's income. The Tax Fairness website has a bunch of different charts looking at this as a revenue source. And one of the most interesting charts is just looking at who would pay for a capital gains tax increase. The proposal is to tax capital gains, the investment income, at the same rate as regular working people's income. If we did that, 97% of it would be paid by those in the top 5% of the income scale, people making over $260,000 a year. So that's just one example of these different types of revenue raisers that the Hawaii Tax Fairness Coalition identified a couple of years ago. And next slide. I know that was a lot, and I'm sorry I had to go through them so quickly. I encourage you to email me or take a look at our website or the Hawaii Tax Fairness website. I'm sure we'll be sending slides around and a recording of the session afterwards. And now we can open it up to questions. Let's see, Will, are you looking? I think I see some
Let's
stuff.
see.
on the-
Let's see in the chat. Where's it?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, let me look
There's-
in.
There's one about DHHL from
What
Eric
is the
Abe.
likelihood- What is the likelihood that DHHL will be able to spend the 600 million by 2025? Will this legislature need to extend or lapse the date on the appropriation this year? Great question, Eric. And I have no idea. I do not own a crystal ball. I do know that it can be difficult sometimes to spend money as a state department. There are, bureaucratic hurdles folks need to go through. I will say, though, that if the department is unable to spend that 600 million by the 2025 cutoff, it would be ideal if the legislature were to look at some options for how that money could stay with the department. Because as I said in my presentation, we don't want this to be a, hey, let's check the box and say, hey, look, we showed up for the Native Hawaiian community, this one year. This is something that needs ongoing support, right? So, from our perspective, if the legislature and the governor are really serious about investing in the Native Hawaiian community, they will do everything in their power to make sure that that money can stay with the department and ensure that those funds get spent for their intended purpose. So, unfortunately, I can't answer your question with absolute clarity, Eric, but I hope that helps provide a little bit additional perspective.
Okay, the next question is from Nadia Garcia in Senator Kim's office. It was mentioned that one-time appropriations are most likely to be underspent. What are the factors linked to this underspending?
Yeah, as I said, it can be sometimes difficult to spend money, right? So state departments need to go through the state procurement code and abide by that process, which at times can be cumbersome. Sometimes it's just as hard to give departments more money as it is to take it away. They also need staff on hand that can actually administer those funds and make sure that those funds are going out the door. So, it's all well and good to stand up a new program at DHS and give them a one-time appropriation, but if they don't have the staff that can administer that program, it's essentially an unfunded mandate from their perspective, and it can be very difficult. So those are just a couple of examples of why those one-time appropriations might get underspent.
Okay.
Let's see, what else we got? Something about marijuana tax. I don't know anything about that. I don't know, Nicole, if you want it, they said, is there no marijuana tax in revenue proposal? I don't know if you're prepared to address that.
Yeah, it was probably mentioned in the 36 original proposals a couple of years ago. One of our factors in choosing these revenue streams was being able to find some pretty good revenue estimates through research and consultation with outside organizations. And I think that was one where it was like really hard to get a sense of how much money would come in. But certainly lots of folks are talking about a marijuana tax. So yeah, that's another one.
Here's a great question about the conveyance tax. Could the state choose to tax the sale of owner-occupied homes at a different rate than the sale of non-owner occupied homes, i.e. second or third homes or investment properties?
I think so. I haven't really thought too hard about that, but we do have, at least at the county level, property taxes are at different levels based on whether or not the property is occupied or not occupied. I'm not an expert in that part of the law, but that's a good idea to take a look at.
Yeah, so I've been doing a little looking into the state's conveyance tax, and we do offer different rates for non-owner occupied units versus owner occupied units. The tax tends to be a little bit higher. So, if we're looking at, this tax from a tax perspective, if we are going to increase the tax on that, I think, targeting those non-owner occupied homes, these are people that are living here part-time of the year. They're not full-time residents. These are folks that are buying tend to buy more expensive real estate, which then can increase the cost of our entire real estate market. If you are going to be making adjustments to the conveyance tax, it would make sense to target, increases towards that population versus owner occupied, right? Versus local residents who are living, working here, contributing to our economy, right?
Alan asked if we get a copy of,
Yep.
sorry, my presentation. Yeah, if you registered for this webinar, which I assume everybody did since you got the Zoom link, you'll be getting a link to the recording of today's session, and we'll make sure that you get links to both of our presentations too.
Yep. Let's see. Okay.
And one of the slides mentioned tax pyramiding is the question. What is it, and can you provide examples? Yeah, it's double taxation, triple taxation. Again, so most states have a sales tax that's just at the cash register. It's at the very end of the whole, like, the thing gets here, it goes through wholesalers, right? It makes its way over to the retail counter and the cash register. Most states just tax at the very end, but Hawaii's GET is different in that we tax all the transactions as it's making its way, off the ship and into the store, which means that the actual tax rate for our GET is higher than the 4% or 4 point whatever percent that you see on your receipt at the store. So yeah, there are some estimates that it might be as high as 11% here in Hawaii, although it's really hard to get at. But tax experts have looked at Hawaii and they've said that this is why our tax base most years is more than 100%, because we're taxing almost everything in Hawaii, and then some of the stuff we're taxing twice because it's changing hands and getting taxed at every step along the way.
Okay. We have a question in the room.
I was going to footnote that, saying that local of the Hawaii Tax Foundation said it's between 13 and 14% when you add up all of the different sequences of the pyramid, which means that's a pretty hefty sales tax.
Yeah.
It's maybe only 11 or 12 or 13, but if it's even that high, that's a nation. Let's say it's
that was a high-end prediction.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You remember Lowell, right?
He was my constituent.
We have another question from the chat. What is the percent of the GET that tourists pay versus locals? Unknown?
Yeah, I've seen various analyses. Anywhere between 30 and 40% is what I've seen.
Okay, great.
So,
Any other
yeah.
questions in the room or on chat? Yes.
Could you go back to the unfunded liabilities, the chart?
Yes, hold on.
The slide for unfunded liabilities. Wasn't sure.
You mean the obligated costs? Yeah.
You call it obligated costs.
Yeah.
It's the health
Or
and
fixed
the
fixed
retirement
costs.
and the health.
Is the 30 to 40% what tourists pay or locals pay?
Tourists pay
Those
30 to 40% of the GET.
So from this chart, what is the total unfunded liabilities? Because it looks like it's low. It's actually about 14, almost 15 billion. And you kind of got like half.
Yeah, this is according to for this year, for this fiscal year.
Well,
Can you share screen?
Can you share?
Sorry. Yeah.
And what was the question, Will? We can't hear very well.
The question was, can you repeat the question? It seems low, is what you're saying?
Liabilities, the last that I looked was 14 billion to 15 billion. And it looks like this chart says it's about half of that.
Yeah.
Someone misunderstanding of what the terms are.
Yeah, this is what we're showing as the cost for the current fiscal year.
Annual cost.
Yeah, the annual cost,
versus
not the total,
cost.
not the total cost.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're trying to represent is the growth over time, right? And like how these costs have fluctuated over time. And really the key takeaway is that the costs are going up, right?
The outstanding amount is 14 billion, and you're saying the annual is 6 billion every year, it's gonna go up?
Yeah, it continues. Well, the trend has been a steady increase, right? With that,
Sure.
aside from that little dip, right, that we had probably because of COVID. But the trend is to continue to go up, right? So folks are living longer, right? Healthcare costs are more expensive. Those costs tend to go up. You know, and then the Medicaid match, you know, we have to be on the hook for that. Because in order to get those federal funds, we have to put up our local match. So basically what we're saying is that, yeah, this is something that we should be paying attention to when we're thinking about the overall budget, because it's an obligated cost, meaning that we have to pay these costs first before we can play around and get creative with any other revenue.
What's the percentage of debt service in for fiscal year 2023?
You know, yeah, I don't have that in front of me now, but it should be in our budget primer. So happy to follow up with you, Alan, at a later date, if you want to reach out to me directly. Let's see. Okay, we have another comment. Says it's hard to hear the comments in the room. I'm sorry about that, folks, for folks that are on Zoom. But there is another question in the chat that says, do supply chain issues have a significant impact on taxation in the state, and how? I don't know, Nicole, do you have a perspective on that?
In terms of just throttling our economy, that would cause a drop in revenues, I guess. But I'm not sure if Reggie was getting at something more than that. But yeah, I mean, I guess supply chain issues, if they make it harder for people to get things and pay for things, then they're not going to be paying as much in taxes. Other than that very simplistic thought, I don't have many others.
Great. Any other questions, either in the chat or in the room? Yes, sir.
Another question. The Alice asset limited income challenged earners actually went up
Good.
To 58%, which tells me, do you guys do your research and look at the structure of the economy? Because I know you're really focusing on the tax system here, but it's the structure of the economy that makes either a robust income for all goes to rise or to fall. And it looks as though the income possibility, I mean, when you have 50% of the population of the state of Hawaii that can't afford to send its kid to school with funds, something's wrong with what we in this building do, or what we've got as a structure of an economy, which is to say this, given that this is how can we tax people more? We're already the highest taxed in the nation. Do you guys do an equivalent of doing, well, how can we lower the taxes, or that's not in your wheelhouse for research? Because we're already the highest, and you're saying, well, let's pile on a little bit more than what we've already got. And the people at the bottom, and we've brought this up in the past, hey, the guys at 11%, at the minimum amount of wages that they're making, they're paying more and more. People are aware in this building of that, and they haven't done anything about it. But my point is about the structure of the economy, and the poor people are getting poorer because of the economy. I don't know if that's a comment.
Sounded like a comment more than a question.
Well, no, I mean, I definitely, I mean, Will and I both talked about tax credits for a big part. I mean, my presentation was about tax credits, and that's literally how to get money into people's pockets, right? So it's not just taxes on high income people, but it's how to get money back to people through the tax system. And the earned income tax credit at the federal level is more than 20 years old. I think Reagan actually started it. It's known as one of the most effective anti-poverty and work incentives in the nation. So, I congratulate the legislature for passing the EITC and joining 30-something other states in 2017, and then boosting it last year. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of tax credits that we have here in Hawaii to help people make ends meet, to help those Alice families not be Alice anymore. I totally agree. We have to work on incomes as well. And there was a minimum wage increase passed this last session, which hopefully will help. But as Will's slide very clearly said, tax credits are this overlooked part of the budget, and an overlooked part of the picture of, it's the other side. People are getting money in, but they're paying out taxes. So we would love to do more of the kind of work we've been doing where we are helping working families with tax credits. How do we pay for it? Well, we identified a few ways that we might be able to pay for it.
Would it not also be, sorry, it's not great, but is it dangerous that we have such a larger reliance on GT tax and sales taxes, which are funded in a large portion by national companies and out of state buy stuff like how we had to give during COVID for our sales tax, which affected a lot of things as well. Plus the mutual regulation on the graph, the local Hawaiian corporations versus the national corporations.
Right.
Is it kind of should be something that we're looking out for? Should it be something that we're looking out for, that it's so high for the national company that they're rising for? Is it okay? And that's already that's the case.
So the question is it dangerous to the structure of the budget that we're relying on GET, or
Not the budget.
Yeah.
Like, are those things, could those things fluctuate, and would those present dangers to here or not really?
well, yeah, yeah, those revenues are going to fluctuate. I think COVID's a great example of that, but how, you saw revenues really take a tank because so much of our economy is dependent on tourism. And when our economy came back, we saw a huge surplus. So it is something that is naturally going to be variable. I think all revenue streams are going to be variable. It is probably one of the more reliable ones that we can bank on, at least. But yeah, I think there's always going to be an inherent risk of recession in the future. And like I showed in my presentation, all those programs that are funded by the general fund, when we go into a recession, those are the most likely to get caught because our revenues are going to go down, right? So that's always an inherent risk. And again, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know when the next recession is going to come. The folks have been predicting a recession for a while, and the jury's still kind of out as to whether or not we are actually in one or not. But so far, we haven't seen, the same kind of massive job losses that we had, during COVID or even during the 2008 financial crisis. So things are looking pretty good right now, but, always will be uncertain for the future. Tina.
Thanks. I feel like this might be a little bit of an ignorant question, but Nicole mentioned that fewer households are accessing social welfare tax credits, largely because the eligibility limits haven't increased with inflation. So has there been like a lot of a discussion in the legislature about addressing eligibility limits instead of just like finding new tax credits or but just like raising the limits across the board or in certain cases?
Yes, there have been bills to increase the renter's credit for years and years and years, both to increase the amount of the renter's credit and to increase the eligibility limits. We did work on fixing the EITC to make sure lower income families can get it. That one actually does go up with inflation because it's tied to the federal, and federal tax brackets do go up with inflation. So that one, luckily, we don't have to fix at the Hawaii level. The food excise tax credit, the last time that one was looked at was 2015. So there, and it did not have automatic inflation increases built into it. So it's fallen behind again. So yeah, certainly there are bills almost every session to look at these tax credits. They usually get a couple of hearings, but they just don't make it through. So not sure why.
Another question coming in from the chat. Are there any parts of Hawaii's tax system that show potential growth in collections, i.e. internet sales, etc.?
Yeah, we showed some of them in that chart. And Alan mentioned marijuana taxes. The global corporations paying taxes in Hawaii is a new idea. And most of the other ones are just, different places where there's some growth. Like I was mentioning with the capital gains tax, for example, 97% of it would be paid by people making more than $260,000 a year. So different types of growth, either adjusting existing ones or finding some new ones. Yeah, there's marijuana comes to mind. Thanks, Alan. And things like this global corporation tax is a possibility. And yeah, internet sales. I thought we already put one in place. I can't remember. But if anyone remembers, I remember reading something about that. We might have one. I feel like I pay taxes when I buy stuff on Amazon.
Oh, just a comment. Nicola told me she agrees that advocates should advocate. This information is good, but unless you have a proposal, it's really just another report. Unless you have coalition built already to support this. Because we in legislative session literally mid-January. You kind of missed the train, so to speak.
Yep, we do. Every session we have a campaign. We have press conferences, op-eds. We get people to testify at hearings for these various ideas. And that's why most, the few victories we've had, that's why they passed, because we had a lot of groups, coalitions, and individuals behind us. But yes, we can work harder for sure. Yep. Oh, Will Carone. Thank you. He put in the chat how we can sign up for updates from the coalition.
Yeah.
So what's your sense with the new administration and some changes in the House, and maybe the lawmakers can chime in on this too, of whether or not tax proposals will advance this session, and if there's a sense of what kinds of tax proposals might advance?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that. Happy to have the legislators weigh in. We know that the governor has really planted his flag on housing and homelessness. That's going to be obviously a huge priority for him. So, if that is in fact the case, looking at something like an increase in the conveyance tax, which 50% of those revenues are dedicated to the rental housing revolving fund, might be a good place for him to look, right? I've heard that he's, wants to, implement recreational marijuana. There would likely be a tax tied to that, if in fact he does go forward with that. Obviously, a lot of this is speculation, but want to hand it over to Nicole to see if you have any thoughts, and then happy to open it up to lawmakers in the room to see what they think.
Yeah, I will not speak on behalf of the new governor. Yeah, we're definitely hoping to open some conversations with him about our ideas. I see a comment or a question from Chuck Walton Why are privately owned apartments on military bases exempt from GE tax?
Mm.
Good question. There's a lot of exemptions. There's a lot of them. I didn't know about that one, and I don't know why that was made an exemption.
Yeah.
Interesting to know.
Someone
about.
needs to look into that.
Can we go back to Governor Green?
Sure.
Neither of us can speak for him, but having worked with him in the House.
Mhm.
What he says he will probably stick to when he says he's gonna take the food in medicine, or at least the over-the-counter medicine, the GT tax off. I think he's gonna give a real push against that. Now, whether he gets it is another thing that the legislature is very reluctant to do, is it's $300 million.
Right.
But he may cut it or compromise or do something, but generally, when he says it, he's not just making it up. Bert, would you?
I don't think we can comment on what governor will do at this point.
Yeah.
I think obviously there are many possibilities for changes in our tax system. Many of the items that are in our tax laws have not been changed for years, are not inflation indexed. Even simple things like the size of the standard deduction for income tax or personal exemption income tax, virtually not looked at year after year.
Yeah.
And
Do you think there's a sense in the House that the House might do something?
You got a budget surplus, you can do a lot of things. Sure. Governor starting out with surplus really gives him a head start, a leg up on whatever he's gonna do. He's got a lot of moving, and the expert behind him, Sylvia Luke, who ran the finance committee, which Bert and I have sat on and probably will sit on. She is a genius in terms of money. She knows where all the stuff is squirreled away in different departments. She knows how to compile it and to bargain very, very astutely, in addition to her new sense of humor, which she
Great, thank you for
Now
that.
she's working for the governor, so that's an interesting factor. Yeah.
Yeah. Sense of humor is much greatly appreciated. All right, well, if there are no other questions, I think I'll wrap up about 3 minutes early. Just want to give big mahalo to everyone that showed up both in the room and on the Zoom. And we'll be in touch. This has been recorded, so you should have, if you registered, should have access to the recording for a while. And then Nicole and I will send out copies of our PowerPoints for folks so you can view them. So thanks again, everyone, and I am going to sign off.
Bert, give me a prognosis of